Hello everyone, you're back with the Lone Wolf once again. Where you live is an extremely important consideration on life's journey. The amenities that are close by, the recreational things that you can engage in, how many people live in the area, what it's like, if it's a dump. And one of my compatriots, you may have heard of him, Carl Benjamin, otherwise known as Sargon of Akkad, right? Has done a great piece on his new project, or his most recent project, the Lotus Eaters podcast, which is a great show with, classical liberal political tendencies. And he's done a piece about my capital city, London. And it's a very well-written piece, so we're going to go through it today. I know I talk a lot about relationships, dating, marriage, and all of those things, but part of the identity of being a lone wolf and following an independent lifestyle is understanding what works and what doesn't within the world, in the West, identifying the problems and challenges and whether the place that you live is going to hell in a handcart or not. And I've been to London a few times, and I'll reflect on that as we go through the piece. I really don't like my capital city at all. The major reasons for that I'm sure that Carl will touch upon in his piece. Anyway, let's begin. Recently, I found myself sitting in a pub on a street corner somewhere in central London, hating every second of it. It was there I realised that I despise modern London. I often get told that it is nice to visit for a few days, but I don't agree. I would disagree there with Carl. Anybody that I've met who comes from other places in the West or even Europe, I've always told to visit London for a weekend, maximum a week, purely because of the cultural landmarks that still exist there, even though, a lot of these groups are trying to tear them down. There's fantastic museums, architecture, history, the cultural and political heritage, whether people like it or not, is there to see and get immersed in. You can go to Buckingham Palace, check out all of the inheritance that we all have as British subjects, British citizens, and immigrants that live here. You wouldn't need longer than a week though. Once you've been there a few days, I've found it quite oppressive at times. But outside of the core metropolitan hub, it's a dismal place. You are absolutely bang on there. It's grimy. Everything feels like it is covered in a layer of grease and dirt. The streets are untidy and have a general appearance of being run down. The incomprehensible graffiti of the aimless youth that defaces shuttered stores barely stands out against the other cluttered shops. Under the grey sky, if you can even see it, the buildings are close packed and the crowded streets are condemned to a cloying claustrophobia by the endless gaggle of wayfaring foreigners passing by. There is no consistency to it. The cultural detritus from all corners of the world creates a landscape of non sequiturs. Next to a shop that has existed since the height of empire is a mosque that has been there less than a decade, followed by the shiny artificial facade of a multinational fast food chain that was built last year. Nobody looks happy at all. The people just seem to exist. They look miserable and wary of one another. They seem like they're trapped in purgatory, and I feel like I'm trapped here with them. Everyone walks briskly by in a sullen, lonesome silence, or gibbering into their earphones in a strange language to someone who could be on the other side of the earth. Each person is radically different to the last, creating the impression that one has arrived in an open-air asylum in which the inmates all have somewhere very pressing to be, but can never quite arrive. This is so well written, this article. I can't understand how anyone could be tempted into this way station of nomadic mercenaries. How can the lure of money be worth sacrificing the comfort of their own homes, or recognizing a familiar face on the way to the shops, or even just a friendly smile shared with a stranger? The atmosphere only grows more suffocating when you see, nestled amongst the steel and glass monstrosities, a fleeting glimpse of the city that once was, the occasional old stone building from the days before diversity was our strength, sticking out like beautiful rebellions against modernism. The new London's demented glass and steel, designed to be devoid of character, intended to warp one's sense of perception and disrupt his sense of equilibrium. By contrast, the old London is bursting with charm and adorned with life. These relics of a forgotten age serve to remind the wayfarer that once this city was not just a temporary habitation for the workers of the world. Once people lived here, really lived I mean. They settled down and raised children, grew old and had a rooted love of their environment. Families bloomed in the places where imposing black buildings now dominate. Delicate architecture, brimming with character, once stood where the needful masses of the earth now scurry past. The people that once cared for this place are now gone, replaced by the rushing river of impatient strangers. Those that remain huddle around the few remaining outposts of the old world. The character of the buildings has been abolished for efficiency's sake. The city is taking on the inhuman character of a corporate utopia, and the denizens seem to have no conception of what has been done to them or why they should even object. Whenever I am fortunate enough to escape and return to the lush hedge-lined roads of the West Country Shires, I think he lives in Swindon, I am overcome with a sense of relief. To be beneath the boughs of the greenwood and walk amongst the habitual growth of ages feels like a return to home. But in the back of my mind, I can still feel the looming coldness of London, that ever-devouring beast, expanding outwards towards my home and corrupting the land it touches with its vanity and progress, forever eating up the lives of the people that sustain it until they too can escape to where they feel like they belong. I can tell that within my lifetime, London will consume the place that I belong, and I shall be forced to become yet another global nomad, with no peace of mind because I have nowhere to call home. What a great piece. Fantastically written and emotional as well, puts across the real, I guess, sense of loss of what once was. And again, just looking at some of these comments, people saying, I felt like this about London for 20 years. It's absolutely horrible outside of the areas preserved as havens for the rich and political. You've got guys like the London Mayor, Sadiq Khan, pathetic level of governance, but, nobody votes him out, so they get what they deserve. You've got a massive gang and knife crime problem in London. Anybody who lives in London, by my reckoning, is either a millionaire, billionaire, a celebrity, an athlete. You've got to be off your rocker to actually stay there because the traffic's a joke. You've got all these congestion charges. People are rude. And I imagine those of you out there who live in other big metropolitan places around the West can empathise a lot with this, and it's probably happening to your city as well. Robert says, sad, London was on my list of places I would like to see before I die. Seems it died before I did. That's a shame. Certainly, come for a week maximum. But if you're gonna come to London, stay there maybe for like a weekend, and then drive up the M1 to York and check out that place. I think York has a lot more character. It's just, much smaller, but there's a lot of history there. There's Viking history, some excellent pubs, and you've got York Minster as well. Very inspiring piece of architecture. Definitely prefer the north to the south of England at times. Well, it's certainly to the London region. This fella Greg, I am a Chicagoan and who lived in the Islington neighbourhood of London, north of Bloomsbury, east of Camden Town, from 2015 to just about a month ago. I worked in Shoreditch, Farringdon and near Tower Bridge, so I commuted around most of north and east London every day for 6 years. I now live in the Cowley neighbourhood of Oxford, about 30 minutes outside of the city centre. While living in London, I like to compare it with my experience of life in New York and Chicago. Some of what Carl is saying matches my experience, but not the whole city. Islington was more like Williamsburg or Windsor Terrace in Brooklyn. Shoreditch very much reminded me of Wrigleyville in Chicago, the nickname for the 10 or so square blocks around Wrigley Field. But London's city centre, especially near the river, is very much like Lower Manhattan near the bay and very much matches Carl's descriptions here. Glass and steel everywhere, sunlight only available in snatches between buildings, transient populations rushing headlong into whatever commercial purpose they've set for themselves, and you best not get in their way. And worst of all, nowhere to sit down and pause and think for a moment, unless you're getting into the back of the cab. It's interesting to note, however, that the area Carl is describing and depicted in some of the photos is only 3 or 4 blocks away from Buckingham Palace and St James's Park. If Carl had walked north from the Albert seen in the photos, I guess that was the pub. Just 3 blocks passing Westminster Chapel, he would have run smack dab into the St James's Park Birdcage Walk, where turning eastward, he could have enjoyed precisely the quiet pastoral leisurely stroll under the trees he imagines having in this piece. To which Lost Alone responds, "You're right, that the park is quite close, but a park isn't a pastoral place. It's ruthlessly manicured. It is a theme park of the country, and it is also surrounded by tourist tat and packed with people taking pictures, and that's fine. Tourists aren't evil, but nothing makes a place feel less like a home than seeing new people every single day, queuing up to take the same selfies. Also, most people genuinely don't know how far away things are in London. The abstraction of the tube map leads to people disappearing underground, popping back up in a new place that is perhaps half a mile away, but never knowing that they could just walk. They never see the normal things that exist between the places they go to." Yeah, if I have the option, I would much rather walk. I'm not a big fan of subways. You tend to get a lot of weirdos on subways in my experience. And they're just claustrophobic places and loud places, so I'd much rather walk and get the exercise. The nicest parts of London, like Hampstead, can only boast to be like normal suburbia, streets that are quiet and more leafy, houses not flats, but there's no chance you could ever afford one of the 6-bedroom gated homes around Hampstead Heath. Yeah, I mean, you've got to be like Henry Cavill or, Emilia Clarke or someone to have one of these places, right? It's ridiculous, and not just that, but areas outside London that are, kind of run down, you're still paying ridiculous amounts of money for houses in those areas just to be on the doorstep, and it's really not worth it. It's not worth the price of admission. Oh, and the constant sirens, absolutely everywhere, all the time. The only cars that move quickly on gridlocked streets. There's always a protest somewhere, always a sticker for some new cause, ever more obscure, and a constant litany of stabbings and muggings and graffiti and morbidity. It's just horrible, dude. Yeah, and I agree completely. The crime problem in London is getting out of hand. Oh, it's already out of hand if you think about the gang situation. You have a beautiful writing style, Carl. I'm Canadian and I feel the same way about the city I'm living in as you do about London. I often feel like I'm living in a foreign land instead of my own country. The former quiet solitude I found at night is often punctuated by sirens, or I'll hear an argument between some drunk and his girlfriend. While I was getting my oil changed a few blocks away from my apartment, 2 workers of the night walked by my car. Free Will 2112. This is what Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is about, the leafy green ancient world of the Shires. But always present is the new looming threat of the grey industrial slag of Mordor and its teeming hordes of mindless violent orcs who uproot and destroy everything of value and beauty. Very much agree. This is how Teesside feels today. It would be sad for the English to end up like the Lombax, but that's what seems to be happening. If being in London or any large city was of genuine beauty and positivity, rich people would not buy homes in the countryside. Doesn't mean you can't live in London, but it is subpar. The outskirts of most cities are all ugly places and always have been. It's where the workers live that keep the centre alive, and for that reason the outskirts can be interesting too, because that is where the people live. Several years ago I once had to do a course in Swindon where Carl lives. At that time, Swindon didn't even seem to have a discernible centre. Well, at least 2 whole generations were wiped out fighting the Germans to make it this way. That's a great point, There's a cenotaph in London where there's a monument to all of the soldiers who were killed throughout the 20th century and beyond, and especially World War I, World War II, fighting for freedom to keep this place free. But when you think about what's sprouted up around it, around the cenotaph, you think, was it really worth it? Certainly not from my experience. You walk around London and you think, well, was it worth dying for this? If it was me, am I going to take bullets on Normandy Beach for this? I don't think I would now. This guy's like, Carl, you see what you want to see. There's also pictures so you can see too. I saw them myself, and Carl has a good point. If you need further evidence, you can use Google Street View. I've done this before for major cities, including London. Carl's point applies in many places as well. It's like, yeah, it's only enjoyable if you've got mega money, absolutely mega money. And even then, if you've got loads of money, why would you live in London? There's so many other great places around the world that you can live that are cheaper. You've got more accessibility, there's more to do, and there's better weather. You're paying to live in London. It rains most of the year. I don't necessarily disagree. I just think it's more complicated. London, as our corporate overlords constantly remind us, is a global city, and there does seem to be a relentless tide of glass and steel, but I think there is still life in her yet. Victoria Street and Walworth Road do make quite a contrast, but you'd be surprised at how different they both look when you get off the main roads. London is a big place. There are communities and green spaces with strong links to the past. Yeah, but that past is gone. It's gone. And people need to recognise that. I mean, any sort of vestiges of the past are being torn down and destroyed. Recently, I lived in a quiet mountain town in the Rockies. It's still beautiful, and while the population is quite diverse, they still seem to share a common culture and love of the city they've built over the last many decades, but there is a rot in the air. A neighbouring city once featured in an 80s movie as a backwards country farm town, now a modern city filled with tech giants, and it's expanding. People are flooding in with money and ideas of progress. For many years, all that could be avoided as they are over there in the now formless budding metropolis, but their dreams of progress and money are endless and rather grotesque. We have a beautiful mountain lake, not particularly useful. It's rather shallow, so not good for boating, and not many native fish, so not good for fishing. But from the gentle mountains on the west side, you can see the reflection of the absolutely huge mountains on the east side, reflecting on the calm waters of the calm lake waters. This guy's vocabulary is not as good as Carl's, I dare say. I love my morning commute, about 6 o'clock every day, watching the sun come up over those mountains, creating majestic purple and orange hues in the sky, that also reflected off the lake, my own bit of heaven. And some developer thinks it would be a sweet idea to put a man-made island with sky-rise hotels in the middle of the lake and bridges to connect this island to the rest. Turn this pristine environment into a tourist destination. Okay, I think I've got the point. I'm not necessarily against developments. I mean, some futuristic buildings can look very good, but it's when it's done at the expense of what's gone before, and the stuff that, there's nothing wrong with it, and we should treasure the history that we have and the culture that we have, whether it's good or bad, and learn from it. The building I work in is an old and converted schoolhouse, but the street it's located on is littered with refuse, rubbish bins and graffiti. It is just out of the centre of an old milling and market town, one with a hilly but pleasant central core, filled with locals and independent shops, but it is surrounded by suburban hell, populated with wastrels, irreverent towards their surroundings. They spill into the area, pollute it with their cigarette butts and empty bottles, as a wild animal marks its territory with excrement. It weighs heavily upon my mind because of the stark and horrible contrast it creates. In the shadow of a church whose origins stretch back to the 1200s, the graveyard is home to loud and abrasive music, obnoxious and crass conversation. It becomes a toilet, a place to empty the bladder that has been filled with mid-morning beer. It disgusts me. Having lived in London just about for over half a decade now, the change has massively accelerated since Khan has become mayor. What did I tell you? I've lived close by to Winchester before this, significant for being the capital of Wessex and England before London, and it feels closer to a culturally English capital than London has since Khan started making his changes. I live in the southwest of the UK. I know the names of nearly everyone on my street, and I live within the town centre. Everyone is friendly, lots of small business owners and regular customers. You always see someone you know and can say hello to or good day. It's not upper class, but it has character. Street crime is pretty low, yes, and there's still dregs around and a few scumbags, but it's nowhere near the kind of deprivation I've seen in London and other major centres. London is not representative of England. Globalism destroys every measure of humanity wherever it is allowed to fester in our society. Like Mordor coiling on the other side of the ridge, waiting for the Dark Lord to turn the eye towards you. That's pretty good Lord of the Rings reference. Excellent piece, Carl. Across the pond we face the same thing, the destruction of our heritage and culture in favour of turning everything into a place where people simply exist, but are living meaningless lives. If I was a Muslim immigrant, I would never want to go to London because it seems like there is simply nothing worth going to. This fellow Ernst says that, I feel you on this. This is exactly how I feel whenever I'm forced to visit Berlin. I hate that dirty, desolate, soul-crushing Moloch and can't get out of there fast enough. Back to my small town in southern Hessen. Just a couple more, I think. I've been living in London all my life and I can tell that something is missing. I'm not sure what exactly, but I know it was there when I was a kid. Going through the streets to places like Camden Market is such a tonal shift. One minute I'm in a dirty street with metal buildings, the next I stepped into the concentrated cultural hub that is the market. It feels like the soul of the city is still here, but it's like it's an echo. Yeah, it's like something from, say, Dark Souls or something. If anybody's played Dark Souls, the game, it's kind of like a there's aspects of story that are told and aspects that aren't. And there's like an undercurrent of decrepitude, if you can understand that analogy. It's probably best if you play it, because you have to sort of feel it than have it spelled out to you. But that's what I draw from this person's comment. I lived in London as a music student, Acton to be specific. This was over a decade ago. Whenever I go back, which isn't often, it's now devoid of the spirit it once had. Expensive, angry and bitter shell of what it once was. I'm not surprised there is a mass exodus of indigenous people for the likes of Bristol. I'm glad to be back in the Portsmouth area for the air alone, and that we have space and certain traditions we carry on throughout the years. No doubt at some point it will become Londonified. I just hope my lovely community can stand strong against it. What if it can't? That's my point with this video today, is I want to illustrate that as a lone wolf you can move wherever you want. You can pack your bags and move to any city in the world if you have resources, and build a new life there, and go to a country where they don't destroy their culture and destroy their history. Integrate, become an immigrant, wherever you're from. Go to a new place and put down roots. And you go to whatever country has the best deal in terms of like the taxes you pay, and then the other things like crime, amenities, cost of living, all of this stuff. You don't have to be loyal to the country that you're from. If you can see stuff like this is happening, at least I know now is to avoid London. People say, "Oh, I want to go to London. I want to move there. I want to go." It's fine if you go there to go to university, right? By all means, go to university in London. They have some of the best universities in the world, but there's absolutely no reason to stay. It's overpriced, crime everywhere. The vestiges of any sort of culture and history are being chipped away at year on year by ideologues. So you really got to take responsibility here and get out while you can, and go to somewhere where you're going to be valued. And that feeds in really well to the lone wolf lifestyle that I talk about on this channel. Thanks for listening, guys. Hope you enjoyed that analysis, and I think it's a great article, and I'll include the link in the description below. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.